The dawn was coming soon. The city had fallen since the previous night. Armed men, brothers in arms up until a few hours ago, now all united in an indeterminable body with seas of people for limbs, and a common spirit that only commanded them to do three things: to steal, to rape, to kill. He had felt the spirit of the mob again in the past, conquering him, like a cudgel that was beating and squashing his brain, turned it to pulp, like a poison running in his veins and darkening his mind, sneaking everywhere, from the last muscle of his body, so he could push himself more, run more, and kill more, to the last neuron in his brain, so he would only think of how to sink his axe, or sword, or morning star, deeper in the neck, the belly, or the head of the enemy. And this murderous craze was leading him to every kind of action that he could not truly fathom the moment he performed it. And as a result, guilt was something unreal, needless, pointless. And how much guilt or regret would he truly be able to feel when he was chasing down the enemy right after the battle, the same enemy who up until moments ago was ready to kill him himself, and would do it without a second thought, but with unending joy and relief filling his insides and coming out in the form of an encouraging towards his comrades scream, so they would keep fighting, so they would defend their homes. Yet this time he was inside a city. It was the first time he had been in the seats of a city, and which city, and because of the buildings that limited his vision in roads and alleys, he could see much more clearly everything that was transpiring. He had not gotten drunk with the battle lust just yet. His personality had not been squashed by the mob's spirit that smothers perception, chokes the conscience, and homogenizes everyone to logical beings with primordial senses and instincts. Blooded corpses of dark-skinned men, women, and children were scattered in every place his eyes focused on. Ravaged bodies, torn and scattered limbs, which seemed to not have an owner, as the red of blood and of the four-ended emblem sewn over his heart decorated the houses with the broken doors, the destroyed walls, the stone-paved blood-stained streets, all the places he could see his up to a moment ago comrades pillaging. Now they were strangers, all of them. The wholly common goal had evaporated from inside them, and something much viler had taken its place. And as he felt the darkness and the cruelty of the world on his skin, as the color of the blood he saw evoked fears and nightmares inside him, he only desired to look upon the ashen grey, just before sunrise sky, and he raised his eyes high, hoping to see a sign. Instinctively, he turned to the walls closer to him, where many men were pulling a rope tied to an iron pole to bring down a green banner, which rippled in the wind, sewn with white crescents. Next to them walked another group who still held torches lit during the night. In front of them, a white-dressed priest who held his own iron pole with a big gilded cross on top of it this time, and a white banner with a red cross waving right underneath, searching for somewhere to set it up. A ruby waterfall was slowly sliding down on the walls, from the battlements on which those soldiers stood and walked around filled with holy hate, to the ground, to meet the same ruby lake. And suddenly he united with that morbid lake, and his clothes were stained with blood when some pillagers knocked him down as they ran in the streets of the city. They didn't stop to look at him, they simply gathered the loot that they dropped, silver cups and various coins, and went on their way, screaming with joy. Cries of pain, hate, elation, shouting in religious hymns, clanging of battle from a few streets away. All the sounds had become one, and yet he could make them out one by one in his ears. He did not know where to go, he did not know what would happen from here on out. His goal had now been achieved. He would stay here or return to his parents' miserable hovel under the shadows of the Alps. The smell of blood was piercing his nostrils and made him want to puke, but he decided to do what he should do and go where he wanted to go, to complete his pilgrimage, to pray. He was thinking about it on the morning of the previous day, as he sat on the desert dune, along with many faces he did not know and some others he had met on the way, starved and exhausted. Over the course of the months-long march, he had steadily lost all those from the village with whom he had started the trip. Some had simply gone back home after they reached the forest of Pannonia. Others had been imprisoned or killed during skirmishes with peasants or with trained forces of the Byzantine army, the army that escorted them through the lush and rich lands of the empire. Others took ships which sailed for to their homes as soon as Antioch fell, as if they had done their duty, as if they were not common deserters with pockets full. He had not gone to Antioch, as the part of the army he was in never entered the city and had made camp too far out, having arrived late, having melted from hunger. How he would have liked to see the city, though. To the tomb of our Savior, Peter had announced loudly the previous morning. Him he had seen sometimes during the march, when he walked around barefoot and dressed in tatters between the soldiers, speaking to them and adding as many small details as he could come up with to the stories about the martyrdom of Jesus. Stories that every time they were told, every day that passed, every league they marched closer to Jerusalem, became more horrific, more inward, more mysterious and bloodier. Stories that blazed their hearts and filled them with hope for the conquering and the liberation of the city, and hate for its citizens, no matter the race or creed they belonged to. Those screams of his that what they were doing was the will of God, along with the Latin chants of the priests in language they did not understand, possessed a strange magnetic property for them, filled them with common soldiers with awe for everything that was holy and they could never touch, power for the war and hope for heaven, meanwhile repelling any thoughts. And that was how things were on the morning of the previous day. Almost 40 days and nights they spent waiting in front of the city's walls, and suddenly, after an exhausting fast during which many died, the white-clad mob was unchained in the night, transforming their starvation, all the hardships of the road, all the griefs of the journey, every misstep and drop of sweat, to blind fury and hate against the infidels, crossing every sort of defense, but also of dignity, of the enemy. At one point the gates were opened, and the mounted knights, who were waiting patiently, rode on their tall steeds to enter the city. The end, and what was to come, was predetermined from the first moment the Crusaders arrived in front of the walls, and was simply being protracted since then. The knights moved into various districts, set up their headquarters and bases, and then started the clearing of the city from the infidel population. Even now, however, there were areas where the Fatimid army was resisting hard. It would not be for much longer. It would all be over soon. With rough orientation, he walked towards where he remembered Jesus' tomb was, when he had watched the city from the Mount of Olives during the fast, as he had nothing better to do while the heat was unbearable. He realized he had taken the correct road when he noticed that the soldiers' numbers were growing, and the results of their pillaging were intensifying towards where he was heading with many others. Almost 20 minutes later, he came to the tomb. Dirty and reeking of the filthiness of the years of the journey, bearded knights stained with blood who had sworn not to save their faces until they had completed their pilgrimage were standing there and waiting around the entrance. Simple soldiers stood further back on a few stolen horses, on wooden crates, on roofs, waiting. As he was searching to find a good place to go so he could have a better view of the tomb, the first cheers of the soldiers started, according to whom they were fighting under or who they supported. The names of Raymond and Godfrey resounded everywhere, shook the earth. He forcefully pulled the shouting, grey-bearded soldier down from the crates he was standing on, and climbed on them to jump on the nearby roof, where a few soldiers were watching the two lords who had just arrived at the tomb. One of the soldiers on the roof was sitting further to the back of the others, emptying his bowel inside a clay pot. He ignored him and looked down at the tomb's entrance. He stayed to watch them for a while, those great lords of western houses, superior to him, on their well-groomed and well-fed steeds. They dismounted and each shook the hand of the other with political courtesy, congratulating themselves on the conquest of the city, and then, surrounded by their armed adjutants, who held banners, torches, and all sorts of treasures to be left for offerings, went ahead and disappeared inside the tomb's entrance. As he was watching all this, his mind was racing. Why should he go back to northern Italy, to the Alps? What did he have there? His great-grandfather's poor sack with a single room, his old and sick parents, a sister that he hoped would have been married off to someone so she would get out of the house and he would not have to feed her, a small and barren field with disappointing yields and where nothing grew in the last few years. Nothing else. Those were also the reasons that made him leave in the first place. He jumped from the roof down to the street, pushing away the grey-bearded soldier who wanted to start a fight when he saw him again, and started observing the corpses to find something to steal. He would complete his pilgrimage and pray later, or tomorrow, or the coming week, coming month, even on the coming year. Maybe he didn't need to pray. Was it really so important? He had come so close to Jesus' tomb and would stay so close for a time to come still. Not even that flat slob Urban who stroked fear on the people of Clermont had ever come so close, and he was supposed to be a servant of his God. He himself had travelled here with his own 2 feet. He had fought for his prophet and the city he had been crucified in. He had killed infidels. His sins were now forgiven. The only thing of importance now was to quickly take anything he could from the heathens, to make his future and new life in Jerusalem as comfortable as possible. There were still infidels alive in the faraway neighborhoods and the suburbs, and there would still be things to find, to steal. He started searching the dead in case something on them had been ignored during the first quick pillaging of his brothers in arms, and followed the road back to where he had come from, drawing his sword, plunging himself in turn into the killing of the blood and the dead, one with a crowd, one with a monstrous body of the mob, one with a many.